Thanks again to everybody for last evening. Randy, Boyd, thank you for everybody feel okay in spite? Yes. It's important to know Scotch works, and so thanks to everyone. Here's what we're going to do. I also want to thank Becky Ash, who's in the back and has one more comment to make, and then we're going to turn this over to the educators. Superintendent, I appreciate your right there leading this discussion with us. We're going to take about 5 minutes each and talk a little bit about public-private partnerships and what's going on here in Knoxville, and then have the rest of the time for questions and answers. So Becky, you had one more thing?
We simply wanted to get our marketing message out there. The can lids that are at your spots are just to remind you that the L&M is aiming to be tops in STEM ed. So thank you guys for being here today.
Thanks so much. It'd be a fun place to go to school, I think. Exactly. All right, so I'm going to dispense, in order to conserve some time, I'm going to dispense with introductions completely and turn it over to Dr. McIntyre, who is the superintendent of the Knoxville school system, and ask you to get started, and I'll get back out of here.
Great. Very good. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here at the L&N STEM Academy. We are delighted to have you here in Knoxville, and delighted to have you here at this unique educational program. You got to experience some of the school this morning and the great leadership that we have in the form of Becky Ash, and it's just a really unique and wonderful place to be, and a place to educate kids. So we're really excited that you're here this morning. I was going to talk a little bit about partnerships and what that means for us here in Knox County Schools and our ability to educate our students effectively. And I guess I want to start with just a little bit of context in that, as you all know, since you all are either involved in education or been talking to you about it, there's been a lot of change in public education in Tennessee the last few years. We've raised our standards significantly. We've put a new teacher evaluation system in place. We have encouraged strategic compensation. We've moved from collective bargaining to collaborative conferencing. We've reformed tenure significantly. So there's been a lot of change in public education the last few years, and certainly a lot of change here in Knox County Schools the last few years. And we're in the midst right now of a strategic planning process. So I've been here 6 years, and we're looking to move from our current 5-year strategic plan to our next 5-year strategic plan. And as we do that, I think we really are considering where we are and where we go for the future. And I think partnerships are going to be an important part of that dialogue. We've had, I think, when you look at the work that's been done over the last few years, we've had the opportunity to really focus on high-quality instruction in our classrooms. And both here in the Knox County Schools and across the state of Tennessee, it's making a difference. It's having an impact. A very positive impact on student learning and success. So if you look at our outcomes over the last few years, you see very strong academic progress as measured by our TCAP scores and our end of course exams outcomes. If you look at our high school graduation rate, we've gone from 79% 5 years ago to 88% for the class of 2013. If you look at our rigor in terms of measured by the number of students who are taking AP courses and AP exams and earning credit on those AP exams, you see an upward trajectory. And for the first time ever, since the state of Tennessee started giving letter grades to schools and school districts, Knox County Schools earned straight A's in achievement this past year. So we're seeing some really great, strong academic progress in Knox County Schools. We're very proud of that, and excited about looking to make that work and those type of outcomes sustainable. And I think when we think about making that sustainable, I think there's 2 places where I need to really highlight. One is certainly working with our teachers to make sure that they have the support and professional development and the resources that they need to do their jobs effectively. But then I think secondly is really relying on our community and on our businesses and on our universities and on our philanthropic community, and on our, the businesses in our area to help us, and certainly our parents as well, and all of our stakeholders to really help and support us in this important work. And so as I look back over the last few years, some of the areas where we have really benefited from enormous generosity and partnership in our community, I think about a couple of very specific examples. One is the STEM Academy. We could not have done this. We could not have opened this unique, wonderful, successful school without the support from the city of Knoxville, our community, many of the businesses that have been in this area. This is the Provision STEM Depot, the University of Tennessee, Pellissippi State, so many of our university partners, and of course businesses who have been an integral part of providing opportunities for our students here at this school and helping us to think through how we prepare our kids for the future. And so I think this is a great example of a really unique educational opportunity that was made possible by partnerships with a variety of different organizations and stakeholders. But there's many other examples as well over the past few years and as we look to the future. We've developed what we call our Education Management Information System, or EMIS. It's a data warehouse that allows us to give virtually real-time information and data to our teachers and to our principals so that they can make good educational decisions and good instructional decisions. And that data warehouse was developed as a partnership with the Knoxville Chamber. So they were very deeply involved in that, and in fact funded the project manager for that project for the first couple of years of that work. We believe very strongly in the notion of multiple pathways to success for students. So we believe that every student can be successful, but it may take different options and different pathways to get them there. And so one of the partnerships that I'm very proud of also is Dr. Paul Kelly Academy, which is a school in the shopping mall here in Knoxville. It is a partnership with the Simon Malls and the Simon Youth Foundation. It's a partnership, again, with the University of Tennessee and with Pellissippi State. And it's a non-traditional school, literally in a storefront in a shopping mall. And we've graduated over the last few years, 2+ years, we've graduated more than 300 students who would not have, most of whom really would have dropped out. These are students who didn't find success in the comprehensive traditional high school, but they've, in a smaller learning environment, differentiated support, and just a different environment, they've been able to be successful. And again, that would not have been possible without the partnerships that we have benefited from. I think about the Leadership Academy with the University of Tennessee to help us grow very intentionally the next generation of great school leaders in Knox County schools, and I know others will talk more about that as we go forward, and I'm glad to talk more about that and really sort of brag on it and rant about it, because it's just an extraordinary program, an extraordinary partnership that's making a huge difference in our ability to educate our kids effectively. I think about things like our Community Schools Initiative, which I'm sure Buzz Thomas from the Great Schools Partnership will talk more about. But through the generosity and the partnership that we have with various individuals and organizations and community groups, we're able to address not only the academic needs of our students, but also to try to address some of those non-academic needs that our students have that might impact their ability to learn effectively in the classroom. So if a student comes to school hungry, or with a health care need, or with a toothache that's been bothering them for 2 weeks, or if there's some chaos in their household, that affects their ability to learn in the classroom. And so we're working with many of our community partners to develop this notion of a community school where we address not only the learning needs, but also some of the non-academic needs of our kids in the schoolhouse and put them in a position to be successful. I can go on and on, I probably shouldn't, but I think it'll be great for us to have a dialogue about some of these things. We've benefited from partnerships with, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who just gave us a grant to be able to really look carefully and in great detail at our expenditures and
making sure that we are using the taxpayers' dollars wisely and effectively. We've been the beneficiary of a partnership with Harvard University, where they place a resident from one of their PhD programs in education leadership, and we've got someone in place right now who is helping facilitate our strategic plan for the next 5 years. Our last resident actually wrote the business plan for this school and allowed us to make it happen. So we've been the beneficiary of so many different partnerships, and I think probably a good lead into what Buzz is going to talk about. We also benefit from his organization, which is the Great Schools Partnership, which is an extraordinary partner that helps us to leverage many of the resources that are available in our community to help us do this job of educating kids effectively in the Knox County schools. So I'll stop there and turn things over.
Okay, well, first of all, let me just say that when I look around this room of people, it makes me feel more optimistic about the future than I was feeling just driving over here this morning. Of the talent that you have brought together. Kathy, Kate, somewhere in the room, I guess you are. There she is back there. Kathy, congratulations on pulling this kind of group together with the bandwidth that this group has. I mean, when I look around the rest of the country, and I travel a lot, I don't think anybody is working harder at getting better than Tennesseans are, and that makes me hopeful. So I wanted to say just a couple of things. The first thing I wanted to say is that education policy work is sexy. That's a whole lot of fun. We've been doing that for a long time. I'm looking at Jamie Woodson, and she's the best education policy person I know. And we've had a great run on ed policy in the last 5 years. But we will win or lose the contest to have great schools at the local level. Now, I'm going to say that again to you. We will win or lose the contest to have great schools at the local level. Jim Clifton makes that point in his great book, The Coming Job War. If you don't know Clifton, he's the chair of the board at the Gallup organization and was their CEO for many, many years. And Clifton says you can't win this battle to create great schools in Washington, D.C. You can't even win it in Nashville. Nashville has to win it for Nashville schools. Knoxville has to win it for Knoxville schools. And all of us working together can share ideas and collaborate and help us be able to do this from Bristol to Memphis. But we must do the work at the local level. And I would say, Jim is talking about collaborative partnerships. I would say you can't get from good to great without those partnerships. Not in the South. Particularly not in the South. I say that because we have never devoted the kind of resources to education that you need to devote in order to have great schools. We didn't have to have great schools because we were an agrarian economy. And when we became a manufacturing economy, they were pretty low-skilled jobs in the main. We still didn't have to have great schools. And now all that's changed, and our kids have to compete not just with the kids in Chicago and Birmingham. They have to compete with the kids in Beijing and Berlin and Calcutta. And I'll just give you one little data point. I was speaking a few years ago at a school district in Long Island, and I've got a daughter that's a professor up at Columbia now. I told her the Clampetts would be shooting their guns off all week. We've got a kid teaching in Ivy League. But I was up there speaking to a group of teachers on Long Island, and the superintendent, I still remember her name, it was Dr. Evelyn Holman. She said, she was telling me about how great their school system was. This is a public school system. And how many kids they had in the Ivy League. They'd sent this many to Harvard and this many to Yale and Columbia and so forth. And I listened to her very politely, and at the end of her little speech, I said, Dr. Holman, how much do you spend per student per year in your school district? Now, this was about 6 or 8 years ago. She said $18,000. We spend about $8,000. Now, the good news is you don't have to spend $18,000 to have great schools. I bet you if we looked, they were wasting a good bit of money in that school district. But the bad news is you don't get there just spending $8,000. That's why these partnerships are critical, because they leverage other resources and assets that we don't have flowing through the public sector into our school system. I actually think it's a better way to get there, because you have seen school districts that have lots of resources flowing into the public system that are not very good school districts. Let's just talk about Washington, D.C. although it's great to see DC improve as much as they did last year. They were like us. They kind of knocked the top out of it in improvement on NAEP. But I think the private-public sector partnerships are better because, as Jim says to me sometimes when he gets a little irritated with me, he said, Buzz, your job is to support and challenge us, and you do a pretty good job of both. Which is his nice, polite way of saying to me, get off my back just a little bit and support me a little more than you're challenging me. But by having a private sector organization like the Great Schools Partnership, Nashville, you've got one, Chattanooga's got the Public Education Foundation with Dan Challoner, there is some distance between you and the school district to be a critical friend and help your school district do things that it might not otherwise do. But you can also be an advocate and a fundraiser. The first thing that I would say you need to do as you look around the state and try to think about these collaborative partnerships is you've got to have a great board. Jamie's got a great board. I've got a great board. I'm looking at Bob Ryder, who will be my next board chair. There wouldn't be a STEM academy here, and there wouldn't be a leadership training program that you'll be talking about the rest of the day without Dean Bob Ryder, who's the Dean of the Ed School here at the university. And Bob is my co-chair right now, vice chair. Jim McIntyre, our superintendent, Lawrence Tullock, Randy Boyd, those kinds of folks, our mayors, our head of our county commission, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the head of the Urban League, the head of the NAACP, bringing all these people together to get serious about creating great schools. We do three basic things at the Great Schools Partnership. First, we function as the R&D partner for the Knox County school system. You know, good old conservative Tennesseans are not going to spend a bunch of money on new innovative ideas, at least tax dollars, until somebody shows them some data that something really works. I mean, it's hard enough to get the county commission to give you money, but especially to give you money for new things that really haven't been tested. That's where we come in. We raise private sector funds to try out new ideas in a limited number of schools, and we very carefully measure the results. And when they work, Jim and I look at it, and he says, you know, Buzz, I think we're ready to take that one over, and we hand it off, and they sustain it. If it's not working, we can kill it off. Jim, I don't think we've had anything that we've dreamed up yet that really hasn't worked. So knock on wood, so far we've been doing well, but it'll be easier for me to kill it off politically, if we have to, than for our superintendent to have to do it. So that's another benefit of having this private sector R&D partner. We also raise money for the school system. We raise about, in our case, we raise about between $5 and $6 million a year. Dan Challoner, I think, is raising closer to $10 to $12 million a year down in Chattanooga. Dan's been at it about 15 years longer than I have, so I hope I can catch up with him. But in Nashville, I don't know how much you're doing, but that's an important function of what these local ed funds need to do. They need to be strategic thinkers. You're not just sponsoring homework parties and buying playground equipment and putting up whiteboards. You're at the table looking at the data with the school district, figuring out what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, what we need to try out that hasn't been tried out that we think will really get traction here, measuring it very carefully, then analyzing it, assessing it, like having these gentlemen here today that can look at our Leadership Academy and say, is it really working as well as we think it is? We think it's working great, but it's important to have outside third-party verification of that. Raising money, and finally the last point that I would make that this organization does and that we will all have to continue doing in Tennessee is we have to continue our advocacy function. And we are a partner with SCORE. SCORE helps us advocate smartly and effectively and helps, I think one of the great functions of SCORE is they can coordinate the advocacy efforts that we are doing across the state so that we're working together in concert and not against one another. We're much more effective that way. We're trying to change the political culture to one that really values education. The world has changed. And you know that, but a lot of our people in Tennessee still don't quite realize that, especially in our rural school districts. But we're going to change that, and we're going to have the great schools that we have all longed to have. Thank you.
I'm Steve Tozer from the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm a professor in education policy studies there.
and with Peter Martinez 12 years ago founded the EDD program in Urban Education Leadership. I also was a department chair in teacher ed at University of Illinois Urbana for a number of years. So I've been doing this work in teacher education and principal preparation now for over 30 years. I want to pick up on a couple of themes that we've heard put on the table already, and one of them is that the future of great schools is really local. I really think that that's true. I also want to say that in order for local agencies to succeed, we need state support. And so when we think about all the partners that Buzz talked about, I want to highlight the fact, and I shared some of this yesterday, Peter and I shared it yesterday with the work team. Although there are a great many players in improving schools, there are a few of us whose job it is to do that work. And one of those is school districts. Another one is states. Statutorily, states are charged with getting this work done well. And another clearly is higher education. We are charged with preparing the personnel for these schools. Historically, those three entities have not worked well together. Now, I'm bound and determined before I leave Knoxville to use one or two of my PowerPoint displays here. But this, as it turns out, I've decided not to use it for this one because I'm keeping an eye on the time. And I wasn't sure if we'd have time for the PowerPoint, so I prepared a handout for all of you that gives you real good information on our program model. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit to respond to what we've heard so far. I think that getting great schools is fundamentally a challenge to local communities and higher education's relationship with local communities and state support of those partnerships. But secondly, I think that we're never going to have great schools without great school principals. There's just no evidence that it's going to happen, and all the evidence is to the contrary, that when you get great school leadership, you can start seeing great classroom instruction, and great classroom instruction is the prerequisite for low-income kids learning well with difficult academic materials. Everybody following the logic here? So one of the things that we say is that if we want to understand where outstanding student learning comes from in low-income environments. And Buzz, I would say that the comments that you made about the South are absolutely true of the North as well. Think about in 1970, this is a surprise, the city in America that had the single highest per capita income was Detroit. Detroit's bankrupt today, but in 1970, a family where nobody had more than a high school diploma could earn enough money to send their kids to college and own the things that Americans expect to own as part of the American dream. That ball game has changed, and we in higher ed and in school districts and in state level agencies have to figure out how to respond to the changed ball game in ways that equip kids for post-secondary success. So I want to say three things about partnerships that, and then ask Peter to respond quickly, and we do need to open this up for comments. By law, the state of Illinois requires that no higher ed institution can deliver principal preparation programs unless it is done in contractual partnership with a school district. Now, this is, in a sense, nothing new for professions. Medical schools all work in conjunction with clinics, hospitals, sites of practice, right? This is how they produce the quality they produce. In Illinois now, in order to produce principals, a higher ed institution, or, and Tennessee allows this statutorily also, or a not-for-profit or other agency that's going to produce principals, has to do it in concert with a school district. Why? Because historically higher ed, this is, Bob will not take offense to this, higher ed has had no skin in the game. We could produce hundreds of credentialed principal candidates who were not qualified and pay no penalty for that. In fact, a perverse incentive system rewarded us for doing it. The more tuition we could bring in, the better it was for our institutions, even if these hundreds and hundreds of credentialed people never applied for an administrative position in schools, and if they did apply, were not qualified for the position. Are you following what's going on here? So what we decided to do in Illinois was to say that can't happen anymore. And the nature of the partnerships is prescribed in 3 ways. We could talk about this alone for a couple of hours, but I'll just lay it out. The partnership between the district and higher ed has to involve the district in the design and the implementation and the assessment of the principal preparation program. This has immediately, dramatically reduced the enrollments in principal prep programs all over the state because school districts have skin in the game and they have no interest in seeing hundreds of people prepared with credentials who are not qualified to be principals in their schools, right? It dramatically reduced, and still we'll be able to outproduce the number of principals we need for the limited number of vacancies. I mentioned this with the work group yesterday. Everybody needs to sort of recognize this. We don't need a great many principals like we need 3.5 million teachers. We don't need a great many principals in any state to improve our schools. Tennessee has around 200 vacancies a year. Illinois has 400 vacancies a year. All the principals in America represent 1/3 the number of practicing physicians in America. All the principals in America could be put in the football stadium at Michigan or in the Rose Bowl. In other words, this is a fairly limited scale operation here if we take it on. Design, implementation, and assessment have to be done on our model with the district and the higher ed institution together. Most districts don't have the resources to produce their own principals without higher ed as a partner. A few are trying nationwide. It's not something I would charge districts to do. Most higher ed institutions simply don't have the capacity to produce high quality principals without partnerships with districts. The role of the state is to support those partnerships. I'll have Peter say a word or two about at a more granular level, but the city of Chicago, for example, Chicago Public Schools, helps us design the assessments by which we know are our principals improving student learning in schools or not. We work together on that so that the school system can say, wow, are we getting a bang for the buck out of University of Illinois Chicago? And because so few leadership preparation programs in the country, almost none, are producing these kinds of data, we've been singled out by all kinds of national agencies. That's part of why I wanted you to see the handout, mainly because we've got the evidence. Most programs are not even collecting the evidence. They don't have the kind of partnership with a school district where the evidence matters. So I'm gonna back off and let Peter say a word or two, and I really would like to entertain as much discussion as possible. I want to underscore everything Buzz said, and I also want to say that for some of us, the central work that we've got to do needs to be done in concert with one another. Peter.
Okay. I'm doing this work at the University of Illinois at Chicago right now because of a previous failed experience that I had as a senior program officer for the MacArthur Foundation, where I managed a $40 million portfolio over a 10-year period from 1991 to 2001. And also during that time, where I served on a board that we set up in Chicago to administer funding from the Annenberg Foundation, and that was $50 million. So I have a tremendous experience at blowing about $90 million in philanthropic dollars in an attempt to improve education and watching way too much of it go down the tube. And it was going down the tube. I mean, we were funding the right stuff. We had plenty of people coming in and helping me figure out what it is we ought to be focusing. We were funding teacher induction programs. We were funding professional development for principals. We had literacy programs. I could go on down the line, focusing on the right stuff. The problem was, and it was well researched, and we had good third-party people that we were funding to help the school do the implementation. The problem was that when you tried to put that good induction program for new teachers into a school, there had to be a principal that was making the following decisions. Would that principal pick the best teacher to be the mentor of the new teachers in that school, or would they do perks with a buddy of theirs and in order to give them an extra $5,000? Would the scheduling in the school be set up in order to enable that mentor to meet with those teachers on a regular basis? And we found out that a lot of the critical things that had to happen for that induction to do that first-year teacher a lot of good didn't happen because the school was not organized in a way that would enable that to happen, and it wasn't a high priority in that individual's mind. One of the things that I tried to do as I began to learn this lesson was to ramp up principal professional development. And what I found was there are things that you can do to help somebody improve, but if you haven't got an individual who's highly committed, who doesn't have high expectations, who is not organized, who is not driven to overcome all obstacles, it doesn't happen. And that's one of the key reasons, and this is the next and final point that I'm going to make, that we made a decision that selectivity of people coming into the program was absolutely critical. There were things that we knew that we could do, but there are things that we couldn't do. Number one, we could not create drive and high expectations. You have to select for that. We don't let anybody into this program that we don't think wants to overcome all obstacles. There are no, the attitude has to be, there are no obstacles that can be overcome. We tell people in the system, if you want to have excuses for failing in the school, believe me, here are 100 of them. If you're going to go for that, we're dead in the water. You've got to have strong instructional knowledge. You've got to have strong interpersonal skills, and a few other things. But those three things are top, and we select for that. So I would urge you to keep that one high in your mind, and keep in mind that a lot of good things that you may be wanting to be put money into are the right things. But if you don't have a principal in that school that is committed to those things and making it happen, you are wasting your bucks.
That's going to be hard to find. We've got some time for questions.
Or comments or major hostile pushback.
You know, a lot of the things that are going on in the state have this diversification of charters, and now there's discussions about vouchers and all these other things. How do you in Knoxville deal with that landscape change that's going on there, and how do you see that impacting here, and then how do you see that impacting some of the course that you're doing from an R&D perspective and from a principal placement perspective?
Great question, very timely question. These are conversations that are happening at the state level right now.
You know, at the moment, we don't have any charter schools in Knoxville. Our board has considered several applications. They've actually approved our charter, but it never got off the ground. But we expect that we'll continue to see some charter applications. I think the Board of Education here in Knoxville is not afraid of charters. They're not opposed to charters. I think they just want to make sure that charter schools, if we have them, are high-quality charter schools. That if we have charter schools, that they are adding value to the landscape of public education and providing opportunity for kids for a bright future. And if charter schools can do that, I think our school board is certainly open to that. And I think what has been said here applies to charter schools as well. You have to have great leadership. You have to have committed and talented faculty. You have to have all the elements and some partnerships as well to make them work. Vouchers are, I think vouchers are a little bit of a different conversation just in terms of it really depends on what the structure of the voucher program is. And personally, I don't have an issue with vouchers if they address the two fundamental elements that I think are necessary in terms of them to be fair and appropriate. One is access, and the other is accountability. So if you're going to use public dollars for private schools, I think you have to ensure that anyone who seeks access to that private school has a fair shot of getting in, and that the school can't say, I want you and you, but I don't want you. And so I think if we are going to do a voucher program in the state of Tennessee that's fair and appropriate, you need to address the issue of access and perhaps make it like a lottery system like you do for charter schools. And then I think the other is accountability and just making sure that if you're receiving public dollars, you have the same measures of types of accountability systems in place for those private schools that receive public dollars as for public schools, that all their kids take some form of assessment so we can measure where they're at, and that the same types of accountability measures are in place for them. But again, I think for me, both of those issues are about how do we ensure that we have high quality education going on, regardless of what the structure is. If it's charters, if it's private schools that receive vouchers, how do we ensure that we're getting high quality instruction happening in those schools and that our kids are getting a great education? And I think that's the important part of both of those conversations.
I want to put a slightly different perspective on that, but it's not inconsistent with what was just said. And that is this, that our principals are recruited heavily by charter management organizations. There are over 100 charter schools in Chicago now out of 600 schools. Actually, it's below 600 because of recent school closings. But a couple of things are important to notice. The first one is, from a systems theory perspective, I really like that old saying that Deming is credited with having said, which was that your system, any system, is designed perfectly to produce the results it's getting. And that means all of us in this room are part of a systemic arrangement of institutions that are getting the outcomes that we're getting in schools that we're not so happy with, right? And so the question is, where's the leverage to change it systemically? So Steve mentioned yesterday that there tends to be some ideological heat around whether you're a charter supporter or not a charter supporter and that sort of thing. And I think that's right, and I think we should avoid that, and I'm glad you're avoiding it. Some of our principals lead charter schools, some of them started charter schools, but I think the thing we need to notice is the following. Charter schools may be good for some kinds of innovation, but they're not a systemic solution. And the thing that we need to be asking is, will we be distracted from systemic solutions if we think charter schools are the answer to systemic solutions, and they're not? Charter schools can be good for some things, and you'll never find me bashing them, but they're not the answer to what ails us system-wide in urban and rural schools of all natures. Secondly, one of the things we've noticed in Chicago is most charter schools aren't very innovative. In other words, the idea of being innovative is a challenge that most charter schools do not rise to. Again, this is not bashing them, it's just saying the contribution they can make is not necessarily one that they're making. One of your old colleagues, Tim Knowles from Boston, now has started charter schools for University of Chicago. Some of them are really good. Some of my principals are leading charter schools that we're really proud of. But if we think about systemic solutions, then we have to start thinking about things that will affect all kids in all schools. And for my money, leadership is the single most cost-effective systemic intervention that we've got. It's a way to intervene at the system level. And boy, you're absolutely right. Charter corporations already know this. They go after our principals like crazy because they know they can't succeed without strong leadership.
I guess this is across the panel. For those of you that are from here, you know what I'm about to say. But for those of you that aren't from Knoxville, you may not know this. Since Dr. McIntyre has been here, the evidence is overwhelming that we've achieved. We've gone up, the statistics are there. There's a handful of people that get that. People that are like people in this room that focus and work on education. Having said that, the political process controls a great deal of what all educators do. And what we here in Knox County are dealing with is the political process just went through, and Dr. McIntyre was reaffirmed by almost unanimous vote that, hey, it's wonderful, it's working, let's go forward and do some more great stuff. Then there was a process through a county commission that brought people in. There was arguments about funding. One gentleman stood up and said, listen, I worked in Oak Ridge during the war and we didn't have computers. I don't think we need them now. I don't know if you remember that day, Tim. But that's the kind of critical thinking that we have in the community. And the sad part is, those are the people.
Mike, I need a question.
But those are the people that vote. Those are the people that vote. And here's, I guess, my question to the panel. With the political process often hand-tying moving forward in this community, does that type thing happen in all communities? And if so, we take one step forward and three backwards just dealing with the political process. What solutions?
When we, I'll take this from the district level and then the state level, very shortly at the district level. It took us 5 years. This is when Steve and I, we hadn't even started our program yet. He was over at the university. I was at the MacArthur Foundation. We were saying to the school district, you need a principal preparation department within your HR to focus on this whole issue of leadership. That took about 4 years of conversation before we got a OPPD, Office for Principal Preparation and Development. We started the conversation in the state about this whole business of being more highly selective, rigorous program, need for internships. Incredible amount of opposition over probably about a 2 or 3 year period when we were trying to put this legislation together. Finally did get it, finally got it to the point where the decision was to close down all principal preparation programs and force them to reapply under a new set of standards. Just getting the legislation was bad enough. Then you had to go through rules for another 2 years in order to get that kind of a decision codified and made. So, yeah.
How did you get the right to file support to get that legislation enacted?
Steve.
Yeah, I headed the legislative task force to do that, and I think I'll be talking with folks from your organization a little bit more about there's a sense in which these changes take time, and one of the reasons they take time is you make a gain and you think you've turned a corner, and then things stall out for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And I think that you got to constantly be monitoring the progress of the agenda. What we did is we got everybody who we thought had political powers. I think your political question is a right one. We got the teachers unions presidents, we got the president of the Principals Association, president of the School Boards Association, anybody we thought had the power to either help or hinder moving forward on this agenda. We put on a single state legislative task force with support from the governor and support from the state, and said, let's hammer this out before we go public with it. It took us 6 months, but by the end of 6 months, we had a unanimous position that went to the legislature and ultimately was approved unanimously by the Illinois General Assembly. So it was a matter of doing the politics relentlessly. I mean, those of us who go into education have a moment where we are misled into thinking we are not into politics. You know, we think we're doing a more pure activity of educating young people. And it turns out that education is, as you say, it's a highly politicized endeavor. And I think we have to develop the appetite to deal with that. Because if we don't develop the appetite to face up to that, those who do have a political appetite will run right over the educators every time. So there's a sense in which, again, partnerships are critical, because I didn't know anything about how to lobby a state legislature. That's not what I do. But by working with groups like SCORE, for example, I was able to learn how to effectively begin to move legislators. Couldn't possibly have done that with just a relationship between me and my school district. In other words, it had to bring in a lot of stakeholders to pull that off. And the state legislative task force was the turning point for us that went from all kinds of great ideas. And I might say, by the way, in terms of quality of ideas, what I'm seeing in Tennessee is just tremendous. If everything that was on paper in Tennessee were implemented, this would be the #1 state in the country in school reform. Seriously. And so it is a matter of mustering the kind of the political moves it takes to take those ideas and get them implemented in a significant way.
Yeah, I was interested when I came from Boston. We have similar type of political mischief as we had up there, except people say it slower, they smile, and they call you sir down here. So that was the big difference for me. I would reiterate what was said about SCORE. I mean, I think that's an incredible asset here in the state of Tennessee that's allowed us to make some incredible gains in terms of education policy and to give real thought to what both the policy and the strategy should be, and then help put it in place. That's been incredible. And I would also, I just wanted to also just sort of recognize that part of why doing public-private partnerships are hard And why not everybody does them is because you do open yourself up a little bit. You know, you're inviting people from outside your school system into the, you know, the sort of the inner workings of what you do, and that's, you know, that opens you up to criticism. It opens you up to improvement, and it opens you up to having critiques that are going to make you better. But sometimes that can open you up to, you know, people taking that and using it, that, you know, as a hammer over your head against you. And so, you know, that's why people, I think, are sometimes cautious about these types of partnerships. But I think the value that you get and the benefit that you get from hearing what the best practices are and having that critical friend sometimes tell you what you need to hear outweighs the potential risk of what people might do with the information.
Lynn? I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Given the premise that principals are so critical that you made, and a lot of us would agree with that, and given the nature of how long principals tend to be in position and sort of the turnover rate and so on, just comment some realistically on what's the time frame like here to see the level of improved functioning performance from people in those positions.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, because there's a little bit of debate in the field right now about what can our expectations be. So I want to give a response on the individual principal level and then a response on the statewide scale level. At the individual principal level, the superintendent of schools for the state of Maryland once said at a national conference, he said, I expect a strong principal to be able to be affecting culture and climate in their first year. I expect them to be affecting quality of instruction in the second year, and I expect them to be able to have an impact on student learning outcomes by the third year. We are seeing exactly that. That's what we see. If a principal isn't having impact on culture and climate in the first year, we probably got the wrong person. Sometimes a matter of fit, sometimes it's a matter of that person's skill set or whatever. So an individual principal, we're finding, can have, 2 years ago we did a study to try to determine how did our first year principals measure up against the rest of the system in Chicago, how did our second year principals, one of my slides has that in this PowerPoint that you're missing, and then and how did third, fourth, and fifth year principals. 6 out of 7 of our first year principals outperformed the system norms in terms of gains of standardized test scores. In other words, this myth that it takes 5 years to make a dent turns out to be wrong. Number two, if you think people want to see change now, and it sounds like principal preparation is a long, slow road. I want to say not so. Over half of Chicago public school principals today have 3 years or less of experience. I mean, this is stunning, right? But what this means, and then what we have for us and for the other major provider for Chicago, which is New Leaders for New Schools. I don't know if there's anybody here from Memphis, but Memphis has a New Leaders program there. New Leaders and my little program and New Leaders' little program have together produced 250 principals for Chicago Public Schools over the last 10 years. And our retention rate in both camps is over 85% to date. When you get the right person stays. They dig in there. This guy's been here 6 years. That's double. He should have been gone after 3, if statistically, right?
A lot of people think that.
So if we do the right selection process that Peter talked about, and then do the right program to give them the skill set, but you're trying to get people whose commitment it is to having an impact on student learning in schools, and who understand it takes time to do that, and the longer they stay, the more impressive the results will be. So what I want to say is that when you stop and think, let's just take a roughly 10% turnover level. That means in 5 years, half the principals in the state will be new principals, right? Coming out of high-end programs instead of coming out as was essentially today a random selection process. So there's a sense, you can't come up with another intervention policy that's going to improve 50% of the schools in 5 years in the state of Tennessee in a significant way. So what I want to say is that this not only turns out to be cost effective, it turns out to be remarkably fast as well. And in Chicago Public Schools, we're just running the old guys out and the new guys in on the basis of performance. Now that sounds terrible. I mean, it sounds like we're heartlessly getting rid of people who've got. The reality is, if the principal, if we don't face up to the assessment of the school leaders, we will pay for it with school failure over and over and over. And we just, as a public, we've got to worry about that.
Yeah. And one of the things that, Just if I can follow up on that. Oh, you know, we're seeing we're seeing candidates come out of our preparation program with the University of Tennessee, and they are extraordinarily well prepared. They spend 15 months in this program. They're with a mentor principal. They have coursework with professors and practitioners. We're taking the learning curve and making it a lot shorter for this incredibly important and complex job. And as much as I'd like to think that the superintendent is the key position in public education, it really is the school principal. And what we're seeing is an interesting outgrowth in that some of our veteran principals, our experienced principals, are saying to us, hey, is there something we can do to go through a leadership academy? Because this job has changed an awful lot in the last decade. And is there something we can do? So one of the things that we're looking at and thinking about and potentially talking about is there a mid-career type of leadership academy that we might be able to put in place that will have an even greater impact on our leadership, because there's our veteran principals who have some great leadership skills and have been successful, but maybe don't have all of the elements of instructional leadership or management that they're interested in. And if we can get that going, that's going to have an even greater impact.
Yeah, I just want to mention a couple of things. Dean Bob Ryder, who's up here in the front, raise your hand, Bob, and Dr. McIntyre worked together on developing this Principals Leadership Academy over 4 years ago and designed it. And the design that they did with that or had there is very similar to the design of Steve and Peter's program in Chicago, which is nationally recognized now after about 12 years, I believe, Steve, as the best program in the country. And so Dr. McIntyre was saying a while ago, we look forward to outside advice. These folks are here to even help the local academy be even better and be sustained for a long term. So I just want to put that in context. So I'd ask, really, Steve, you and Dr. McIntyre, maybe Bob Ryder, to add in, what are the distinctives of these kinds of principal preparation programs, say 3 major distinctives or so, versus traditional programs?
We are absolutely seeing, the research is clear on this. The programs that are leading the battle here all have some key similarities in common. And I'll tell you what one of them is, and it shouldn't surprise us, but it is intensive clinical experiences in the form of internships or residencies. Up until now, the national model, any number of studies shows this, principals have been produced by book learning in the classrooms. And what these new models do, whether it's run by nonprofits like New Leaders or by New York City Leadership Academy or Gwinnett County, Georgia, where the district runs it, or by higher ed like us, intensive clinical experience is one. A second one is high assessment of candidates from the admissions through the end, and the willingness, therefore, to dismiss candidates from the program if they are not producing the goods that are necessary to produce student learning in schools. So one is heavy clinical experiences, which, by the way, afford the opportunity for assessment of candidates that are not otherwise afforded if you don't have heavy clinical experiences. For us, it's a 12-month full-year immersion in a full-time administrative job that's paid for by the school district. Because for the school district, this is a tremendous investment, because they're going to get back out of this a proven leader instead of somebody they hope can lead, right? So clinical is one. The assessment part is another. Peter, I've got a third that I'd put on the table, but do you want to slip one in?
I'm going to ask you to be kind of quick, and then I'll get one more question.
Then I'll say what it is. It's close collaboration between academic and clinical faculty, right? The academic faculty often are not the kind of people who should be supervising principals in schools, because they themselves don't have that background. But a real close programmatic collaboration is terrific.
I would add a cohort model to that. I feel very strongly that our candidates working together and learning from each other make them better candidates for leadership, and then they have a built-in network also of support when they become principals. Unfortunately, one of the defining characteristics is cost also. It's a significant investment to do it right and to do it well, and that's why I think it's important that Dr. Tozier, Dr. Martinez are here to help us think about sustainability, replicability, and how you scale things like this up. And then I would also echo the selectivity and the assessment along the way. I actually teach one of the courses in the Leadership Academy. I teach the school finance course. And what is beautiful about that for me is it's a semester-long interview for these folks. You know, I get to know them in a way that I wouldn't know our other candidates for principalship. I get to know their strengths, their weaknesses, and where it might be a good fit for them to be a school principal.
There's just one other and that is, you know, the other thing is, has been mentioned many times by our panel, is the collaboration between the school system, the community, the university, and in our case, it's also having a faculty member who has also been a practicing principal. And Betty Sue Sparks is here, sitting in the back, who is the current director of our Leadership Academy from the university side. And she occupies what's called a principal in residence position that is funded by Cornerstone Foundation here in Knoxville. And without that position, without having somebody who has the credibility of being in the classroom, being in the principal's office for many, many years, and then being that mentor for all of the fellows that come through our program, we would not enjoy the success that we're enjoying. So Betty Sue has been critically important to us.
Very